Well, first of all, I got to say it's absolutely wonderful to see a packed house. Having been giving talks on 9/11 and similar issues for a number of years, I'm more used to giving talks to 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 people. And over the last 12 months, I've seen that grow to 10s and 20s and 30s and 40s until last Tuesday in Lewis, we had nearly 200. And then tonight, we have over 500. So this is an absolutely tremendous turnout. So for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Ian Crane. I am the chair of the 9/11 Truth Movement in the UK. So on behalf of the UK 9/11 Truth Movement, welcome to Conway Hall this evening. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction, but I would like to bring our guests out this evening. Now, you're going to hear David Shayler and David Ray Griffin this evening. David Shayler is known to many of you. David Ray Griffin, of course, many of you will know him from his book, The New Pearl Harbor. Call it a hunch, but I would suggest that there probably aren't too many in the room who've read any of his previous 20 books, but I'm sure most of you know The New Pearl Harbor. So let me bring out David Shayler and Dr. David Ray Griffin. Okay, just a few basic announcements first. As many of you will know, that we are making this a 9/11 Truth Weekend, of which this is the first event. Tomorrow at the Brixton Mass, which is a nightclub now, but I believe it's a converted church, from 11 o'clock tomorrow morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, there will be a 9/11 Truth gathering, where there will be an opportunity to watch some films. I believe we're showing Everybody's Got to Learn Sometime and Who Killed John O'Neill. And there will be a number of workshops looking at ways in which we can further the awareness of the 9/11 truth throughout the UK. And I know that tonight there are people here from all over the country. One of the reasons I'm actually quite relaxed to see the hall full is that I was responsible for the online ticket selling, and at least I know that most of the tickets got there. But we have people here from the north of Scotland, from Glasgow, from the northwest, from the northeast, from North Wales, from Mid Wales, South Wales, Cornwall and Kent. So this is truly the first gathering of the UK 9/11 Truth Movement. What time is your last train? You're very welcome. At the back we have various stalls, and outside there's a whole host of DVDs, and 2 of our members have put together these 9/11 Truth Packs, where you can purchase 3 DVDs. There's Terror Storm, Loose Change 2, and David Shayler's Mind the Gap, his documentary looking at the events of 7/7, an alternative view of the events of 7/7. 3 DVDs for £5, and they are copyable, so they are there for you to purchase and then distribute amongst your friends and family. This evening is really very special. It's come together with the effort of a very loose-knit group. One of the strengths of the 9/11 Truth Movement is that we don't necessarily have to agree with each other on every detail. The commonality is our desire to get an investigation reopened into the events of 9/11 because we question the veracity of the official account. The detail, the conjecture goes on within the movement, but it doesn't in any way detract from our unified focus. There will be much debate tomorrow on specific details. Perhaps some of that debate might get a little bit heated, but it will not in any way detract from the unity of the UK 9/11 Truth Movement. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker tonight. Now, David Shayler I first give a talk on the Jimmy Walter Tour last year. And there's no question in my mind that the Jimmy Walter Tour was the catalyst for the 9/11 Truth movement to come together. Because prior to that, there were many of us doing our own individual research at various locations around the country. Some of us were suffering from ridicule from friends and family, but we kept on with our research because we felt that the truth had not been told. Jimmy Walter's tour gave us an opportunity to come together, and that was in May of 2005. So in just 15 months, the UK Truth movement has grown, and today I have no idea how many people would consider themselves part of that group, but I know that we have, I think, over 800 people who are signed up to the forum on www.911.co.uk, and that is growing at an exponential rate. David Shayler was a participant in that tour. I didn't really get to meet him until he came down to give a talk in Totnes some 6 months later. And over the last almost year now, I've got to know David and Annie very well indeed. And what can one say? Here is a man who absolutely has the courage to live out his conviction. I'm not going to tell his story. He can tell you the story. But I think it's a story that is an inspiration, should be an inspiration to everybody in the room. So over the last year or so, as I've got to know him very well, it's an absolute pleasure to be able to call David and Annie friends and colleagues and fellow activists of the 9/11 Truth movement. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you David Shayler.
So I find it slightly strange speaking behind a microphone like this, but I think we're going to do it for the recordings, unfortunately. But I'm kind of very much in the kind of 19th century where you turn up with a loud voice and tell people what you think. Sometimes that can get you into trouble, of course, or in my case, prison. But yeah, I did go back to the experience of how I got into this because really, all the things I've done in my life, the most unlikely thing I've ever done was to in fact work for MI5. It's an exception to my life. It's not something I was ever interested in. In fact, my history was actually the opposite. It was actually exposing the intelligence services and writing articles complaining about the lack of civil liberties in this country that I did before I actually worked there. But clearly, my time there showed me something very, very obvious, and that is that the intelligence services abuse the trust that we place in them. Many people think we don't need intelligence services. We do. We do need protecting from dangerous elements. But what we don't need, of course, is a service that either creates those dangerous elements or is in fact the dangerous element itself. And I was actually quite relieved to find that MI5 didn't actually go out and kill people. I mean, it was still pretty awful in terms of respecting civil liberties, but as far as I could see from when I was there, it didn't kill people. So it was with horror that I was actually briefed on an operation in which MI6 funded associates of Osama bin Laden in Libya to carry out an assassination of Colonel Gaddafi. Now, at this time, this was absolutely perplexing because I had absolutely no idea why MI6 would want to give money to people who are the new terrorist threat. In fact, at this point, MI5 had set up a new section called G9C to deal specifically with the threat from Islamic extremist terrorism. And yet here were MI6 giving money to these people to assassinate Colonel Gaddafi, who by that point had renounced terrorism. So there is actually no logic to this. When you get these people sometimes in the British media, the ill-informed journalists we have to deal with, they will try and say, oh yeah, Gaddafi was a problem, Gaddafi supported the IRA. But all that had gone by that point. He'd ceased to do that kind of thing. And it's now clear to me what happened when I tried to reveal that to a wider public. You see the mentality of the British government, the mentality particularly of obviously our Prime Minister Tony Blair. I was very much brought to realise that Blair was in fact a right-wing extremist, a neocon and so on before other people, because 3 months into his premiership, I tried to give my evidence about MI6 funding Al-Qaeda. I tried to do so again in July 1998. So here I was, giving evidence to the British Prime Minister through a legal route that agents of the secret state had not just conspired to overthrow a foreign government, but they had killed innocent individuals in the process. And what's more, they'd use taxpayers' money to do it. Now, in those circumstances, you probably think, I know who we should be arresting here and locking up. The people who carried out the murder, the terrorism. That's the way it normally works. But in this particular instance, I was the one who finished up in prison. I went to prison because I tried to reveal this information. But it gets worse. I mean, unfortunately, I had actually given an interview to the BBC, to Mark Urban, who's the defence correspondent of the BBC, for this very eventuality, or indeed for the eventuality of me being killed. And to anybody who thinks that's fanciful, I've been in 3 suspicious car accidents. I'm only here by the grace of my guardian angel. And so in that situation, I was in prison, but this interview could be shown. So the interview was shown. Mark Urban stood up, key parts of what I was saying, so it's no longer just me saying this. The British government didn't want it to be shown on British television, but in the end they had to back down because the story appeared in the New York Times. And so this full story got an airing in a Panorama special. Yet 36 hours later, the Foreign Secretary tells us that this is pure fantasy with no basis in fact. Now, how could Robin Cook arrive at that conclusion in 36 hours? Clearly, he'd gone to the head of MI6, had a conversation with the head of MI6, and MI6 had clearly said to him, this is pure fantasy, Minister. And Cook probably made a calculated decision. And that was, there's a lot of problems in this country who stand up the intelligence services. They don't just think they run the show, they do. And on the other hand, of course, there's some poor whistleblower, you can discredit his character. But crucially, no one will ever be able to gainsay this because there is no oversight of the British intelligence services. The British intelligence services are a law unto themselves because Parliament cannot ask them questions that they must answer under oath or call for documents. There is no penalty for them not complying. They can simply say this would cause harm to national security in giving documents to our elected representatives, which of course is a nonsense, and that's how they managed to escape the scrutiny. So Cook said this was pure fantasy, thinking, of course, he would get away with this. But fortunately, somebody decided to put a document on the internet. The first time, as I'm aware, in history that an MI6 document ever appeared on the internet. And that document confirmed that the MI6 agent, who was codenamed Tunworth, was in fact part of the coup plot. He wasn't simply reporting on it. It confirmed that he was leading a group of Islamic extremists. So there could be no doubt about that. And crucially, because this document predated the plot, it was their plans in future, it accurately described the modus operandi which was to be used and was subsequently used. So it showed prior knowledge of the operation. So there could be really no doubt that this was, in fact, the basis for fact, in fact, of what I was saying, that I was no longer somebody just saying this by myself. However, to give you an insight into the kind of society we live in at the moment, the Foreign Office of this country will still tell you that what I am saying is pure fantasy. They will refuse to acknowledge the existence of this document on the internet. And this is the kind of totalitarian George Orwell 1984 world we live in. In fact, it's a world in which we can no longer trust the mainstream media. Only this week, we invited into our homes a journalist from the New Statesman. He came along and said he wanted to find out about the 9/11 truth movement. And he did what any tabloid journalist would do. He interviewed us, took bits out to make us look stupid, introduced evidence which he'd never been allowed to comment on, and did no research into the material we gave him. In fact, we gave him David's book, The New Pearl Harbor, and said this will be an excellent introduction to 9/11. I know that because that's how I got into it. But he didn't read any of that. And then proceeded to have the cheek, without doing any research, to accuse us of skewing historical truth. And this is the problem, is that we are facing now, is the mainstream media lives and exists off advertising. The advertisers can threaten to pull their advertising. Or they are too controlled or too close to the government or the intelligence service, or they can be threatened. But the point is, despite all of that, despite there being virtually no coverage whatsoever in the mainstream media, you're all here tonight. And loads of people out there are learning the truth. And they're learning the truth because it is patently obvious. Tomorrow I'm going to be on the Heaven and Earth show. And I was talking to a researcher about this. And he kept saying to me, why do people put so much store in these conspiracy theories? Is this something in our society? Perhaps the lack of religion is causing this. And I said to him, well, what do you mean by conspiracy theory? He put our famous thing back. You know, we have a conspiracy theory. 4 guys, 3 from Leeds, 1 from Aylesbury, conspire with each other and absolutely nobody else to carry out suicide bombings on the London Underground. That's a conspiracy theory. It's a theory that people conspired to carry out a terrorist attack. Unfortunately, this particular conspiracy theory is not based upon fact. In fact, the reason we know that, of course, is they won't allow us to have any kind of independent inquiry into 7/7. Think about it. This is the biggest terrorist attack on British soil in history, and we are not allowed to know what happened. What is more, the intelligence services are not going to be subject to scrutiny, so they can learn from their mistakes, because that attack happening was obviously an enormous mistake on their behalf. But the problem, of course, with the conspiracy theory thing is what they use to actually brand us. And this guy kept saying about conspiracy theories, and I kept saying, well, hang on. You think people are attached to this because you think they're lame-minded. But haven't it actually occurred to you that people are attached to these things because they are the truth? Because he hadn't done the research himself. And I have to say, when I was first approached just over a year ago by the 9/11 Truth Movement, when people start telling you a 47-story building came down the middle of New York that day and no one else has heard of it, you start thinking, what are these people talking about? Until you check it and you see the photographs and you see the footage come down, footage of it coming down, and you realise, yes, this did happen. Not just that, you actually realise that the owner of the site's given an interview in which he said the decision was made to have the building pulled. Larry Silverstein, the owner of Building 7, in fact, has admitted that Building 7 was brought down by controlled demolition. This is what we were being attacked for in the New Statesman article, saying things like this. Interestingly as well, though, with the official stories, only this week, the NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology in the US, has started to refute the official story. They say that the pancake effect, that the idea that the steel columns bowed out and floors fell on top of each other, which has been put forward by the Federal Emergency Management Agency for the last 5 years, is in fact untrue. They are saying this doesn't stand up to scientific scrutiny. Now you'd think someone in the New Statesman might think, hang on, that's interesting. I wonder why there's a discrepancy between 2 official bodies in this story. But oh no, they quoted bits out of the press release uncritically. You know, where have we come? And what do these journalists get off on by doing things like this? You know, it's so easy to do, to go into someone's home, to interview them, someone who's going to trust you and try and tell you their story honestly or the facts honestly. What then possesses somebody to go off and uncover other evidence they don't show to that interviewee and then put in the paper to make them look stupid? Now, why would someone do that? Why would someone want to harm a movement that's trying to get at the truth? Why would a journalist want to stop someone getting at the truth? And so we have to realise that there are a lot of corrupt people out there. Now, this particular journalist used to belong to the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party. Now, this, of course, is a front for the CIA. Not saying Brendan O'Neill, the journalist involved, is a CIA agent, but certainly the article worked in the interests of the elements of the CIA who are behind 9/11. I don't want to say too much more, really, other than to sort of mention a little bit about David Ray Griffin here, and just to say, for those of you who haven't read the new Pearl Harbor and the 9/11 Commission, Omissions and Distortions, please do. They are extremely well-written books. They're very, very easy to read, extremely well-researched and well-sourced. And they tell you, again, some things that almost seem crazy. That, in fact, the 9/11 Commission is apparently unaware that Building 7 came down that day because they don't mention it in the report. They try to tell us that the Twin Towers collapsed because the central core columns, the 47 core columns made of reinforced steel and concrete, weren't in fact at all load-bearing, when documents from architects and scientists have shown that in fact they bore half the weight of the building. But this is what happens. This is what happens with the 19 hijackers, for example, where the 9/11 Commission will tell us that the 19 hijackers are the people who carried out 9/11. Now, I was very suspicious about this because as a former counter-terrorist officer, I would know that unless you've got prior intelligence, after an attack, it's chaos, 24 hours, 48 hours, like for anybody else. But of course, you then start doing the investigation. But what you can't do is the day after that say, we know it was these 19 people, especially when those 19 people don't appear on the flight manifests. Especially when the director of the FBI has subsequently told CNN that there is no evidence that could be used in court to prove that these people are the hijackers. Or what's worse, though, is on the 23rd of September, 2 weeks after 9/11, these people popped up alive. 9 of them popped up and said, look, we're alive. Gave interviews not just to some wacko conspiracy theory site, to the BBC, to the Daily Telegraph, to the Independent. And yet the 9/11 Commission doesn't recognise that any of this happened at all. Now, there could be different stories. It could be that the FBI is telling us the truth. It could be these people have just made this up. But until somebody in an inquiry takes the evidence and starts cross-examining witnesses, we'll be none the wiser, basically. So my own personal odyssey into 9/11 began with reading The New Pearl Harbor. As I say, it goes from all these things I'm mentioning here about the Arab passengers not being on the flight manifests, through to, say, the collapse of the buildings that is clearly a controlled demolition. Buildings that fall down, you would see large pieces of masonry and so on. What you see in this case, of course, is buildings that collapse uniformly in their own footprint. In the case of the Twin Towers, in 10 seconds. In the case of Building 7, in 6.5 seconds. But there is some hope from this. And this is again missed by the New Statesman. The National Institute of Science and Technology has now said that it's going to look at the hypothesis of controlled demolition with regard to Building 7. So slowly but surely this is coming out. And I want to just say before I go how important this subject is. I was arguing again with this New Statesman journalist about how important this was. That 9/11 was the cause of the war on terror. The war on terror is the cause of the war on our freedoms, and not just the war on, what we might think of the luxury freedoms of Western society, on the very basis of Western society, the idea of not being tortured or not being put in prison without a fair trial. These that go to the very core of our civilization. So the war on terror is in fact a war on Western civilization. But we can very easily bring this war on our civilization to an end. And we can do that by exposing 9/11. And let's face it, it's not difficult. The plan went wrong. That day, they wanted to put the 4th plane, or the 4th whatever it was, down on Washington so they could declare martial law. In those circumstances, no one can stop them going into Iraq straight away, going into Iran, going where the hell they like, because they can tell the American people what they like, because they no longer have a free media and a free press. But because that didn't happen, and that we do live ostensibly in a democratic society at the moment, if we can't expose this, we don't deserve to live in that democracy. It is so easy. It is so obvious once you research it, once you get people to actually read the books that you give them. And therefore, we should take this as a special issue. We should actually go and persuade people anywhere. Don't be afraid to look like a so-called conspiracy theorist. I'd rather somebody said that you're a nutter, but I went out and said the truth. Then I stopped telling the truth because I was scared of being called a nutter, basically. That is the way you do it. You go out there and you attack on these grounds. And I tell you why you attack. Because we can't prevaricate now. We can't sit here saying, should I be doing this? Oh, God, what if I stick my head above the parapet? They'll come and have a go at me, all this kind of thing. Because if we take that attitude, in 5 years' time, there may no longer be the democratic apparatus for us to have meetings like this, for us to lobby our parliament and so on. So I'd say to people now, go out there and do it. Write to the New Statesman. Expose journalists who are stooges of the CIA like Brendan O'Neill. Expose the mainstream media people who are stooges of the New World Order. But whatever you do, go out and do it now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Stirring stuff. Our next guest has really been a catalyst for the global 9/11 truth movement. Prior to the appearance of the new Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of internet discussion. There was a lot of people getting involved from all walks of life, and it was being dismissed as conspiracy theories. Dr. David Ray Griffin, by his own admission, absolutely accepted the official account for 18 months or so. before some colleagues drew his attention to some of the anomalies in the official account. So he went away and did some research for himself and was shocked by what he saw. The result of that was the new Pearl Harbor, a reference, of course, to a comment made in the PNAC document, Rebuilding America's Defenses. Dr. David Ray Griffin brought a gravitas to this movement and to this quest for truth that nobody else had been able to bring to it at that time. He still brings that gravitas. He is a leading member of Scholars for Truth. It is thanks to Dr. David Ray Griffin and this tour in Europe. He was in Amsterdam last night. From here, he goes to Copenhagen and then to Bologna. It is thanks to his participation that Loose Change 2 is being broadcast in 50 countries worldwide over the next week or so. I believe that Dr. David Ray Griffin's appearance in the UK has led to the most balanced media coverage we have seen in the UK media regarding the 9/11 quest for truth for 5 years. And I think that over the next few days, as Dr. David Ray Griffin appears on the Heaven and Earth show, and I think he spends all afternoon with the BBC in various interviews, I think we will see that continue and to grow. This is truly, truly a catalytic moment for the promotion of 9/11 truth. And it is great pleasure that we're able to introduce the man at the center of that. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David Ray Griffin.
Thank you. The title of my lecture tonight is 9/11, Should the Truth Be Revealed or Concealed? Now, it may seem obvious to all of you that, of course, it should be revealed. But at the end of the talk, I will explain why, to certain members of our societies, that may well not be so obvious. But before getting to that, I have to discuss what the truth is. If by that we mean the details of what happened on that day and leading up to it, there's much that we do not know. But there is one thing that anyone with a 20% open mind can know, which is that the official story is false. We can put this issue in terms of the term conspiracy theories. In our societies, it's almost Pavlovian. When that term is mentioned, people say, well, I don't believe in conspiracy theories myself. But of course, we all do. Our newspapers are full of conspiracy theories, because a conspiracy theory is simply, a conspiracy is when 2 or 3 people or more conspire in secret to do something illegal. And our newspapers are full of those, from conspiring to rob the local bank or dime store to Enron executives conspiring to defraud their investors. So we would all be much more honest if we, like Michael Moore, said, now, I'm not into conspiracy theories, except the ones that are true. Nevertheless, that term continues to be used to discredit our movement. So for most journalists, simply to call something a conspiracy theory is to discredit it. And the term, of course, was used by President Bush shortly after 9/11 when he said, do not tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories. Interesting, that exact same phrase was used by Philip Zelikow, who then became the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, also warned against outrageous conspiracy theories. What could these men mean by that? They can't mean we should reject all conspiracy theories, because the official theory is a conspiracy theory, according to which Osama bin Laden and some Arab Muslims conspired to bring about these events. So what they really mean is only we should reject outrageous conspiracy theories. But what would an outrageous conspiracy theory be? Well, we can think about this in terms of the philosophy of science. There they talk about the difference between good and bad theories. A good theory is one that is consistent with all the relevant facts. A bad theory is one that is inconsistent with some of the relevant facts. An outrageous theory would be one that is inconsistent with all the relevant facts. So you see, Bush was really being very subtle. We missed it. He was really saying, don't believe the official theory. Because the official theory is contradicted by all the relevant facts. And that is what I will talk about now. What is the official conspiracy theory? Has at least 7 major points. First, the attacks were ordered by Osama bin Laden. Second, the attacks were carried out by 19 Arab Muslims under the leadership of Muhammad Atta. Third, this team of al-Qaeda terrorists managed to hijack 4 airliners and crash them into buildings in spite of a system involving the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, and the U.S. Air Force designed to prevent such occurrences. Fourth, these clever terrorists also managed by crashing into 3 buildings of the World Trade Center by crashing into 2 of them to cause 3 of them to collapse. They were also able to crash a hijacked airliner into the Pentagon. Sixth, we can be sure that the attack was orchestrated by al-Qaeda because it was the only organization with the motive and the means to carry out the operation. And 7, we can believe all this because it has been verified by the 9/11 Commission, which was a fully independent, impartial commission. So let's look at these one by one. Ordered by Osama bin Laden. This claim, of course, was used to justify the attack on Afghanistan and the war on terror aimed at Arab and Muslim countries. But no proof was ever given. Colin Powell was supposed to provide a white paper, but he never did. So Tony Blair provided such a paper, but then he pointed out it does not purport to provide a prosecutable case against Osama bin Laden in a court of law. So good enough to go to war, but not good enough to go to court. The Taliban told the Bush administration, if you show us some evidence that Osama bin Laden was involved in 9/11, we will gladly hand him over. The Bush administration refused. They claimed they didn't need it a little later because a video was found in Afghanistan in which Osama bin Laden confessed. But as most of you know, the Osama bin Laden of this video had darker skin, fuller cheeks, a broader nose than the Osama bin Laden that we all know and love. The only thing they had in common was they both had a beard. Those of you who don't know about this, go on Google and just look under fake bin Laden video. Some of you have probably heard that a new bin Laden video has come out showing Osama bin Laden talking with some of the hijackers. We can call this the much more sophisticated fake bin Laden video. I'll talk about that a little more later. Osama bin Laden, of course, started his career, his public career, as a CIA operative. There's some evidence that he never gave up this role. In July of 2001, he was already America's most wanted criminal. And yet, reportedly, by a very good reporter, he was in the American hospital in Dubai, being treated by an American doctor and visited by the local CIA agent. Also, afterwards, while we were going after him in Afghanistan, he miraculously escaped time and time again, till finally the Battle of Tora Bora, which the Telegraph called a grand charade. Finally, it is not just members of the 9/11 Truth Movement who doubt this part of the story. If you go on the FBI's most wanted website and look under Osama bin Laden, you will find he's wanted for several bombings, various terrorist attacks, but he's not wanted for 9/11. So an American member of the 9/11 Truth Movement named Ed Haas, who has a website called Muckraker Report, so you can look this up for yourself, called up Rex Toome, the chief of investigative publicity for the FBI, and asked him why not. Toome said, the reason why 9/11 is not mentioned on Osama bin Laden's most wanted page is because the FBI has no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. So much for the first point. But even if Osama bin Laden wasn't involved, surely we know, point number 2, the attacks were carried out by 19 Arab Muslims. Now, one part of this story, of course, was that they were very devout Muslims who were ready to meet their maker. So they wouldn't mind participating in a suicide attack. The 9/11 Commission report even said that Muhammad Atta, the ringleader, had become very religious, even fanatically so. But Daniel Hopsicker, an investigative journalist, found that Atta loved cocaine, alcohol, gambling, pork, and lap dancing. The Wall Street Journal even reported that several other members of the hijacking team had similar tastes and often went to Las Vegas to indulge them. The 9/11 Commission knew this had been reported, but it said, we could find no credible evidence explaining why, on this occasion, some particular occasion, and others, the operatives flew to or met in Las Vegas. Evidently, the commissioners wouldn't read a left-wing rag like the Wall Street Journal. Also, of course, if you look at the flight manifest that the airlines have released, there are no Arab names on the flight manifest. And yet they allegedly bought tickets. They had to be on the flight manifest. All the evidence connecting them to the flights is also suspect. In the general mythology, people can cite all this evidence. Oh, we know this because we know this and this and this. Well, let's look at this. Because we've seen videos of them getting on the planes. Well, no. There's a video of one of the alleged hijackers in Washington Dulles Airport, allegedly. But security video cameras, on every frame is marked the time, the location, and the camera. Look at this frame. You will see none of that. What about Atta being at the Boston airport? Surely he had to be at the Boston airport to get on Flight 11. We have no evidence that he was at the Boston airport. You say, well, we've seen a photo. No, that's a photo from Portland, Maine. The night before, strangely, he was already in Boston. He and a fellow hijacker drove up to Portland, stayed overnight, and then got on a commuter flight back to Boston the next morning. But you've probably noticed that sometimes commuter flights are delayed or canceled. Can you believe he would have risked the whole operation to do that? It looks more like, as Ian Henschel and Roland Morgan have suggested, that the whole trip to Portland was simply to leave behind a bag, the famous bag. And what's wrong with that story? It's got all that evidence in there, information about Boeing's and instructions to the other hijackers about what to do and a Quran and all of that. And Muhammad Atta's will. If you were going to fly a plane into the World Trade Center, would you take your will with you? But we know they were on the planes because we had all those phone calls where passengers talked about the Arabs on the planes. A lot of those phone calls were cell phone calls. Which airline is it that has just... Ryan has just announced this week or this month that now they have the technology where you can make cell phone calls from in the air above 2,000 feet. That was just developed in 2004 and is just now available. So back in 2001, these phone calls, cell phone calls, were strictly impossible. At that time, you could only make cell phone calls reliably under 2,000 feet. Between 2,000 and 8,000 feet, it was iffy. You might not, it might cut in and out. Over 8,000 feet, essentially impossible. And yet Flight 93, which had the most so-called cell phone calls, was at 30,000 feet. So it would have been completely impossible. Those, if you've seen the movie United 93, they make a lot of very clear phone calls with their cell phones. So this suggests something else is going on. There was another technology that was available in 2001 called voice morphing. And there are two ways to do this. One is you can create a tape in advance that seems to have somebody else's voice on there saying something. So William Arkin reported that they gave him a demonstration in which he heard Colin Powell saying, "I am being treated well by my captors." And another general said, "Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government." Of course, neither of those generals said those words, and yet everybody in the room who didn't know better would have sworn that was the voice of those two generals. Another way you can do it, you can do real-time voice morphing. So you create a device in which you just speak into it, and the voice of the person you want to mimic comes out the other end. We have some internal evidence that at least some of the calls were of this nature, besides the fact that they were impossible at that time. The famous call, of course, where Mrs. Bingham gets on, not Mrs. Bingham, but Mark Bingham's mother, has a different name, got on the phone and heard the voice say, "Mom, this is Mark Bingham." You get the point. You never, even under the most stressful circumstance, ever called your mother and used your last name. Now, let me come to this new bin Laden video. Besides voice morphing, you know about photo morphing and video morphing. So most of you have seen Forrest Gump. So in the movie Forrest Gump, you had Forrest Gump being played by Tom Hanks, shaking hands with President Kennedy, being played by John F. Kennedy. Absolutely realistic. So when you see this new bin Laden video, think Forrest Gump. Another problem, of course, is the report that some of the alleged hijackers were still alive. This was reported by the BBC that Walid al-Shiri was alive, that he called a press conference in Morocco, where he's a pilot, and said, "I didn't die on 9/11. What did the 9/11 Commission do? Did they refute this? Did they say this was mistaken identity? No. It actually couldn't be mistaken identity. The photograph was sent around the world, and it was his own photograph that al-Shiri saw on TV, and that led him to call the press conference. What did the 9/11 Commission do? They speculated that it was Walid al-Shiri who stabbed a flight attendant on Flight 11 shortly before it ran into the North Tower. That's the level of research you had by the 9/11 Commission. So what we have here is another false flag operation, which imperial powers have used from time immemorial. When you have an enemy you want to attack, you make it look like they've attacked you first. So, of course, Hitler, when he wanted to invade Poland, had some Germans dress up in Polish uniforms and attack 21 places along the German-Polish border. Operation Himmler. So the next morning he got up and explained to the Germans, this is why we have attacked Poland. They attacked us first. This is defense. And likewise, when the Japanese wanted to take over Manchuria, they blew up their own airline near Mukden and blamed the Chinese and proceeded to slaughter several million Chinese. So, in false flag operations, you always leave evidence around. So the Germans took some convicts, dressed them up in Polish uniforms, and then killed them and left them at the scene to prove that Poland had attacked. So it's not surprising there is a lot of evidence scattered around suggesting that these alleged hijackers really did do the operation. Third, 4 teams of Muslim Arab hijackers outwitted the world's most sophisticated defense system. Standard operating procedure between the FAA and the U.S. military says that if an FAA controller sees any sign that a plane is in trouble, the transponder goes off, you lose radio contact, the plane veers radically off course, and you can't get it back within a minute, you call the military. Military calls the nearest Air Force base with fighters on alert and has them scramble a couple jets, and they go intercept and see what's wrong. And then if there's something seriously wrong and the plane won't obey, they take more drastic action. That normally takes about 10 minutes, the whole operation. Never more than 15 minutes, probably. That morning, 10, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes went by. Nothing happens. Why not? Well, we've had 3 stories. First story was we didn't send up any fighters at all until after the Pentagon was hit. That would mean a full 90 minutes had gone by before the first signs of trouble. That was told by Richard Myers, acting chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Mike Snyder, spokesperson for NORAD. That sounded very bad. People started saying, is this a stand-down order? Very quickly, we got story number 2, which became the official story, published on September 18th, 2001, in which NORAD put a timeline out and said, here's where we learned about this flight, here's when, and here's when we scrambled, here's when we heard about the second flight, here's when we scrambled, and so on. But early members of the 9/11 Truth Movement did the math. And they said, okay, let's take it as an assumption that the FAA was really as irresponsible as you say, and instead of notifying within a minute or 2, they didn't notify you for 20, 30, or 40 minutes. They did the math and said, you still had time to intercept, because your planes go very fast, and you've always bragged about how quickly you can scramble these planes. So when the 9/11 Commission report came out, we got a third story. The third story said, well, you were right, military, about the first story, but not the second 3. The truth is the FAA didn't notify you at all about those flights until after they crashed. You read this account and you see the scenario they paint in there, that these controllers who have done this 100 times a year or more for the last several decades, evidently flawlessly, suddenly that day nobody could do anything right. So the controllers would look at the planes and the transponders would go off, and sometimes they hit the trifecta. All 3 things happened, and yet they would sit around saying, should we tell anybody about this? Gee, I don't know. And then they'd finally tell their supervisor, and the supervisor would, Finally, they might call Herndon, and Herndon would sit on it for a while, and then they might call the FAA. Of course, they've got this myth that it had to go up this chain of command, and later they violate it. They have Boston calling the military directly, so why didn't they do that in the first place? But nevertheless, they had to go up the chain of the command. And it would always get to the FAA headquarters in Washington, and nobody there would call the military. Totally beyond belief. And yet, you count them up in my second book, 9/11 Commission Report, and you see about 18 times the FAA screws up in a huge way. So first of all, that whole story is just implausible. A second problem with this third story is simply that it is the third story. If you've got a suspect in a criminal case and he tells you 2 or 3 different stories, you start to get a little suspicious. Let's say, the local bank in a small town was robbed, and they think Charlie Smith probably did it. So they go look up Charlie and say, Charlie, where were you Saturday night? He says, oh, Saturday night I was at the movie. No, Charlie, movie theater's been closed all week. Oh, that's right, I was with my girlfriend. No, Charlie, we checked with her, and she was home with her husband. He says, oh, that's right. That was the night I stayed home and read my Bible. You're probably not going to believe that. Think the Tonight Show is watching? A third problem with this third story is that it contradicts the second story, which we lived with for over 3 years. Let's take Flight 77 for illustration. According to the second story, the official story from September 18th on, the military was notified about Flight 77 at 9:24. And at 9:30, planes were scrambled from Langley Air Force Base. When General Larry Arnold, who was in charge that day down in Florida, and other officers talked to the 9/11 Commission in 2003, they repeated that story. But then when they were brought back in 2004, the commissions had tapes from NORAD. It played those tapes, and it said, look, what you told us is not true. Listen to the tapes. You were not notified about Flight 77, and therefore you didn't scramble those planes at 9:30 because of Flight 77. No, what happened was a controller in Boston got confused and thought Flight 11 hadn't really hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. It was still up and headed towards Washington, and you told the military that, and that's why they scrambled the planes from Langley. Why didn't you tell us that then? General Arnold says, oh, I forgot. Can you imagine this? The biggest, the one time they finally scrambled planes that day, it was to go after a phantom flight that didn't exist. Big embarrassment. He would have been furious with the FAA for having given him that false information, and 2 years later, he forgot. He didn't remember. This, early in August, a story came out in Vanity Fair, because this new story hadn't gotten any traction in the public, because everybody praises the 9/11 Commission report, like the Bible, but nobody actually reads it. And so they didn't know that there was this new story. So they had to get this in the public consciousness. So this story comes out by Michael Bronner, who just coincidentally happened to be one of the producers of this new this film called United 93, and that has all the stuff about the cell phones. And this new story lays out this new story in some detail, and answers a question I had raised in my book. If the 9/11 Commission said, General Arnold, everything you said was incorrect, they repeat that 3 times. They didn't answer, how could have it been incorrect? Was it because he was lying, or was he confused? If he was confused, that's pretty hard to believe. 1 week after 9/11, he could have been confused and forgotten already about Phantom Flight 11. So he must have been lying. And furthermore, they said, we really are certain he must be lying because he listened to the tapes before he came in and testified in 2003. And yet he comes in and tells a story that contradicts the tapes. How could that be? So, and then just this week also, or last week, the book by Kane and Hamilton, the chair and the co-chair of the commission, has come out called Without Precedent. And that's the main point of the book, is that they're pretty convinced the military lied to them. Now, the New York Times has published a long editorial endorsing every element of this and not raising a single critical question like, does this fit with any human psychology we have ever heard of? Because here's what they're saying. The story they had been telling put the FAA in kind of a bad light. Yeah, they were late, but they did finally notify them about all the flights. And actually, in time, they could have intercepted. And therefore, it put the military in kind of a bad light because they didn't intercept. And as I say, when these guys did the math, they said it looks like you had a stand down or at least a slow down. So the claim now is that that was a lie, that the truth was a story that put the military in the clear, because the news story says the FAA was even worse than you had said they were. They didn't notify you about Flight 175 until after it hit the World Trade Center South Tower. Didn't tell you about Flight 77 until it hit the Pentagon, allegedly. And didn't tell you about Flight 93 until after it had crashed. What would have been Larry Arnold's motive for telling a lie that would have protected the FAA and made it look like he was guilty of maybe murder and treason? Completely unmotivated lie. There's no explanation why he would have lied. They say, well, he was trying to cover up confusion. But the confusion, almost all the confusion, was that of the FAA, not the military. So this is the thing, and yet they tell this story that is completely implausible from the point of view of human psychology and certainly military psychology, to put the blame, part of the blame on themselves. And yet nobody in the official world or the newspaper world questions it. So what is my explanation? Well, again, voice morphing. These NORAD tapes, I would argue, most plausibly, were made after Larry Arnold had listened to the tapes in 2003. And that's why he didn't know that they weren't notified about 77. That's why he didn't know about Phantom Flight 11. It didn't exist yet. It was only created in late 2003 or early 2004. And so we've got this situation. So have any of you, has this story gotten any press over here, the Vanity Fair story by Bronner? It got a lot of a little bit, but a lot of attention in America, and everybody, all the newspapers are saying, now we know it was just mass confusion, and the military fudged the truth, but no explanation, no explanation of why they would have told such an irrational lie. Furthermore, this story is completely contradicted by a memo that Laura Brown issued to the commission in 2003 after Jane Garvey had testified. I've quoted this at some length, and if you read the 9/11 Commission report, you see Laura Brown is kind of a heroine. I didn't do much original research for this book. I mainly just took the work of others and put it together and told the story. But here I did a little original research. I called up Laura Brown at her home on a Sunday. She had given me permission to do through email. And she told me about this. And here's what her memo says. That within minutes after the first aircraft hit the World Trade Center, which would be about 8:50, the FAA immediately established several phone bridges, teleconferences, that connected the FAA with the military. The FAA shared real-time information about all the flights of interest, including Flight 77. NORAD logs indicate that the FAA made formal notification about American Flight 77 at 9:24, but information about the flight was conveyed continuously during the phone bridges before the formal notification. So you see, she was challenging the old story. Now the new official story doesn't even accept that. Says they were never notified about Flight 77. But this shows that, according to Laura Brown, that the military was notified about Flight 77 far before 9/24. And Richard Benveniste then, the commissioner, read into the record this statement. So now he read that memo into the statement, and then he said, so now we have in question whether there was an informal, real-time communication of the situation, including Flight 77's situation, to personnel at NORAD. So how did the 9/11 Commission deal with this fact, which they had discussed in open testimony? In the Commission report, they simply deleted Laura Brown's memo. They deleted Benveniste's comment. And the 9/11 Commission report simply said, NEAD's, NORAD's Northeast sector, never received notice that American 77 was hijacked. That is the level of lying that goes on in this report. Obvious lying that the press will not reveal a bit of. Okay, the third point does not stand up. 19 Arab Muslims did not defeat the most sophisticated defense system in history. U.S. military was given stand-down order. Now, let me turn to number 4. These Arab Muslims, by crashing planes into 2 buildings of the World Trade Center, were able to cause the total collapse of 3 of them. This amounts to the claim that besides defeating the most powerful military defense system, they also defeated several laws of physics. Now, this is the main event, of course, of 9/11, this double image of the planes ramming into the buildings and then the buildings coming down. First of all, the towers exploding and then the buildings coming down. So it's the crucial event, as Kevin Ryan points out in the book that Peter Dale Scott and I have just co-edited that's just come out called 9/11 and American Empire, Intellectuals Speak Out. Kevin Ryan was the whistleblower at Underwriters Laboratory who got fired for blowing the whistle. So why the collapse? The official theory, of course, is the impact, we're talking about the towers, Twin Towers, the impact of the plane plus the fires. But the impact of the plane is trivial, insignificant. The buildings were built on the assumption they might be hit with a plane about the same size as a Boeing 767. Also, many supporters of the official story, like Thomas Eagar of MIT, has said the impact of the planes would have been insignificant in these highly redundant buildings. Also, Building 7, of course, was not hit by a plane, and yet it collapses in essentially the same way, different, but essentially the same way as the towers. So you don't need the planes to explain the collapses. So everything rests on fire. It's a fire theory of the collapses. Problem with this, problems are multiple, but just to go quickly to the main point, fire has never brought down a steel frame high-rise building. Never before 9/11, never after 9/11, never anywhere in the world on 9/11 except Manhattan. And these were relatively insignificant fires. To do something to steel, steel is a great conductor of heat. So if you heat up this part of the steel and it's connected with other parts of the steel, the heat is going to dissipate throughout the building. So for huge buildings like this, 110 stories, with steel going from the sub-basements up above the top floor, you would need a huge fire, and it would have to burn a very long time. Well, the fires were not huge. We see this big fireball from the South Tower when the plane hits it and the fireball goes out. But what that means is most of the jet fuel burned up outside the window, so there was very little left to fuel a fire. So the fire in the South Tower was actually smaller than the fire in the North Tower, and yet miraculously the South Tower collapses first in only 56 seconds. So something's wrong right there with the official theory. But 56 minutes, and for the North Tower, 102 minutes. We had a huge fire in Philadelphia in 1991, burned for 18 hours, no collapse. A big fire in Caracas, burned for 17 hours, no collapse. And yet these buildings allegedly were brought down by fire in 56 and 102 minutes. The only way buildings like this have ever come down in total collapse is through explosives. Wouldn't it seem likely then that these buildings also came down? So the normal assumption should be these buildings were brought down by explosives. The thing the journalists ought to question is anybody who says otherwise. And normally we say extraordinary claims take extraordinary evidence. This would be an extraordinary claim that not only 1, but 3 buildings came down on that day from fire when it had never happened before. So those guys ought to be on the defensive. The official conspiracy theorists, they should be challenged at every level. And yet the journalists turn on us and say, how ridiculous. They think explosives brought down the building just because every other collapse in history has been caused by explosives. So you see how silly the whole thing is. Anyway, besides that this would be the natural assumption, there are at least 10 characteristics of controlled demolitions of this type, which is called implosion, where the walls come in on themselves. The easy kind of controlled demolition is you knock some things out and cause the building to topple over. But if those 110-story buildings and that 47-story had toppled over, you would have had mass destruction in lower Manhattan. These buildings had to come straight down. This is a science or an art, very precise. And as you can read on Implosion World, there are only a few companies in the world with the expertise to pull off a genuine implosion. And yet we're supposed to believe that on that day, fire just happened to mimic a true implosion. So what are these features? First of all, sudden onset. Fire, if it were to weaken steel, the steel would begin to sag. The building would start to get contorted. But you look at the videos, the buildings are absolutely stable. And then they explode. Or if you look at Building 7 video, it's absolutely stable and then straight down, suddenly. Secondly, the straight down. How do you achieve that? Well, all the steel columns, the vertical columns, have to be sliced simultaneously, or it won't be vertical. If you do this side first, the building's going to fall over. That means that in the Twin Towers, you had 47 core columns, 236 perimeter columns, total of 283 columns. These fires that were up here and scattered around and very asymmetrical had to weaken those, melt or somehow weaken those 283 columns simultaneously. In other words, to believe in the official story is to believe in a miracle, to believe in magic. It's an outrageous conspiracy theory. Building 7, by the way, had 24 core columns and 57 perimeters, so they're demanding enough. 81 columns had to collapse simultaneously. Thirdly, come down at almost free fall speed. Even the 9/11 Commission report admits that the South Tower collapsed in 10 seconds, which would be virtually free fall through the air. And if you look at the videos, you see that the things that in the towers, things explode out and fall down. They're falling at the same speed as the things that are falling in the profile of the building, which means that those lower floors, those lower 70 or 90 floors, with all that steel and concrete are not offering any resistance to the upper floors. They just fall through them like there's nothing there but air. The law of conservation of momentum says there has to be a delay at each of the floors. Let's say there was a half-second delay. That would still be very fast, pancaking down. That would mean for 90 floors, 45 seconds, and yet the buildings came down in 10 seconds. Total collapse, that means all the steel columns had to be sliced or somehow break simultaneously, spontaneously. The pancake theory, which is now discredited, but that's what most people still believe. They keep saying the floors pancaked down. Well, if that were the case, that means the floors broke loose from the columns. They were hitched to the perimeter columns and the central core columns. They broke loose, according to Thomas Eager, and this is what the 9/11 Commission report endorsed. That means the floors would have collapsed down. You still would have had those 47 core columns sticking up about 1,000 feet in the air. Total collapse into a pile a few stories high. The Building 7, total collapse into something, because it was a true implosion. They didn't have to make it look like it started from the top and do all that stuff because the planes hit it. They just imploded it from the bottom they collapse over perfectly, a very tiny pile of rubble for a 47-story building. All the steel, in fact, was sliced. The pieces come down and they're 50 feet in length or less. About, most of them about the size to be ready to be loaded on trucks. And incidentally, Controlled Demolition Incorporated had an ad on its website that says, "Our system segments steel components into pieces matching the lifting capacity of the available equipment." Another remarkable fact, all of this concrete in these buildings, which was a huge amount, was pulverized into tiny dust particles. If you dropped a big segment of concrete from 110 stories, it would break into a pretty small pile of rubble. But they might be like this big. They wouldn't be like 10 microns in size. So we're talking about a tremendous amount of energy to pulverize not only the concrete, but all the desks, the computers, virtually everything in the building except the steel, pulverized into tiny dust particles. Also then these dust clouds, and Jim Hoffman has done a study of the North Tower, the expansion of the dust clouds. And he said that just the energy required to expand the dust cloud would take 10 times, at least 10 times the amount of energy of the gravity. And see, that's the official theory. The only energy available was gravitational energy, just to expand. So that's looking aside from the energy needed to slice the steel and pulverize all the concrete. So we're talking about a huge, humongous violation of laws of physics. Furthermore, horizontal ejections from the Twin Towers, they don't just come straight down. They begin by exploding outward with pieces of aluminum and steel being forced out 400 to 500 feet. Tremendous amount of energy. Gravitational energy is vertical. What is providing the horizontal energy for all that steel and aluminum? Molten metal. This is not controversial. Even Marc Loiseau, who was the head of Controlled Demolition, in charge of cleaning up, and also Peter Tully, also in charge of cleanup, both said there were rivers of molten steel or molten metal under all three buildings. This molten metal remained hot for well over a month, so the floor, the ground, you couldn't walk on. It would burn your boots. A tremendous amount of energy to produce that much heat. If on figures here, melting steel, let's see, I skipped over that page. I've got, do you all know Fahrenheit as well as Celsius, or do you need Celsius? Okay, Fahrenheit's fine, I got that in my head. The melting point of steel begins about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. An open hydrocarbon fire, like with kerosene, which is what jet fuel is. Even if there had been any jet fuel left, it all burned up within 10 minutes. But even if there had been, an open fire like that, at most, under the most ideal circumstances, can only get up to 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. So you would be at least 1,100 degrees short of being able to even begin to melt steel. And actually the fires could not have been over 12 or even maybe 800 degrees Fahrenheit. So it would take 3 times as much heat to even begin to melt steel. So again, the official story is completely, radically inconsistent with scientific facts. The evidence is overwhelming that the official story about the World Trade Center is false. There must have been massive amount of explosive placed in the buildings. Now the question comes up, well, how could that happen? How could, with a security system in place, how could have anybody got in there to, well, I would say, yeah, if you're asking about Al-Qaeda terrorists, they could not have gotten in there to plant the explosives. But if you're talking about more homegrown terrorists, it's interesting to know, and many of you know this, who was in charge of Securicom, Who were two principals of Curacom, who's in charge of, security for the World Trade Center? The president's brother, Marvin Bush, and their cousin, Wirt Walker III, was the CEO. So it's not impossible to imagine how homegrown terrorists might have got in there to plant explosives. Okay, we come now to the fifth part. Al-Qaeda hijacker Hani Hanjour flew American Airlines Flight 77 into the West Wing of the Pentagon. There's so many things wrong with this story. One, of course, is that Hani Hanjour was known as a horrible pilot who could hardly fly a tiny Cessna. And yet he was supposedly flying this large airliner and making this magnificent 270-degree downward spiral, coming in at ground level without disturbing a bit of grass on the Pentagon's lawn, and crashing into the Pentagon between the first and second floor. That's one problem. Another problem is, why the West Wing? Why would he go to all that work to hit the West Wing when it was the absolutely worst part of the Pentagon to hit? These brilliant terrorists, brilliant enough to out-trick the American Air Force, would have known that the East Wing is where they wanted to hit. That's where Rumsfeld and all the top brass were. The West Wing was being renovated. There were just lowly people over there and, workers and so. And besides being renovated, it caused much less damage than hitting any other part of the Pentagon would. All they had to do was fly right into the roof of the Pentagon, which is several acres in size, and so maybe even Hani Hanjour could have hit it, Furthermore, there's strong evidence that it was not even a Boeing 757. There's not the debris that you would expect. You've seen the pictures, many of you. The lawn outside, there are no wings, no fuselage, no engines. So the plane must have gone inside. But you ask the chief of the firefighters and the head of the renovation project, no, we didn't see any big pieces of a plane in here, no wings, no. Where did the plane go? It vaporized. The heat was so hot. It was so, even vaporized the steel-tempered engines. But we know that the hijackers were on there and the passengers from Flight 77 because we identified them from their fingerprints, or another version has it from their DNA. So this is a very, our country's famous for a magic bullet. Now here you have a magic fire. Another problem, Pentagon, most well-protected building in the world, surely. So besides the fact you've got Andrews Air Force Base right next door, which a website shortly before 9/11 said has 3 squadrons that keep fighters on alert 24/7. Right after 9/11, they said, no, we had to call them from Langley because we didn't have any fighters on alert. Can you believe that? Andrews Air Force Base is to protect the Pentagon, the White House, the Houses of Congress, and most important, the U.S. Treasury building. And they didn't have fighters on alert on 9/11. Completely implausible, and yet that's the official story. Furthermore, even if everybody had been asleep at Andrews, we have it from many different reports, people who have been working at the Pentagon, visiting there and being shown around, that it's protected by surface-to-air missiles. And that's what you would expect. When Bush went to Bologna, and Genoa, and there was concern for terrorist attack, they installed these missiles on his hotel. So surely the Pentagon generals would protect themselves as well as they would protect the president. And yet, and these surface-to-air missiles would be fixed so that they would go off automatically if any plane came in this forbidden zone that did not have a military transponder radiating a friendly signal. So even if it were the case that it was Flight 77, commercial airliner, it would have been shot down before it could have hit the Pentagon. So the attack on the Pentagon could have only been an inside job. Sixth element in the official story. Al-Qaeda was the only organization with the motive to carry out the operation. We've already seen that Al-Qaeda did not have the means. They couldn't have done any of these things. But the idea is they had this great motive. They hated Americans and our freedoms. And that's what motivated them. And nobody else had a comparable motive, according to the 9/11 Commission, headed by Philip Zelikow. But one reads around, one finds some little motives. The neocons, and of course many of them, including Cheney and Rumsfeld, become central members of the Bush administration, and Wolfowitz, Pearl, so on. In the 1990s, soon as the Soviet Union imploded, they said, look, we've had this bipolar world for a long time. We've got a unipolar world now. We're the only superpower. We could keep it this way. They started writing that explicitly, saying, and then in 1992, Cheney, when he was outgoing defense secretary, had Wolfowitz and Libby write this document called Defense Planning Guidance for 1992. And in there they announced that the United States goal now will be to prevent any rival from ever emerging. The Republicans then lost the election, and the Democrats were in power for 8 years. But the neocons kept the vision alive, kept urging President Clinton to attack Iraq, ignore United Nations, ignore international law. They then at the end of 2002 put out this document called Rebuilding America's Defenses, this organization called Project for the New American Century, in which they laid out these various things that they would need for what they themselves called a Pax Americana. So what we have here is the desire to create the first global, truly global empire in history, the first borderless empire, a pretty heady idea. We're bigger than Rome. We're bigger than the British Empire. We're bigger than any empire ever. That might provide a motivation for certain kinds of personalities. This defense planning guidance, by the way, was called by one critic Cheney's plan to rule the world. The requirements were get control of the oil, particularly in the Middle East, to have a new doctrine of preemption in which we can attack a country even if no attack from them is imminent. A huge increase of several hundred billions of dollars for the military, even though we were already spending more for military affairs than the rest of the world put together. A technological transformation of the military, which means basically computerizing everything, including putting weapons in space, including nuclear weapons. And this is going to be enormously expensive, so how is it going to come about? And the document goes on to say, that this process of transformation will probably be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. So the Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld administration had some motives slightly more powerful than the motives of Al-Qaeda, but the 9/11 Commission, headed by neocon Philip Zelikow, did not see fit, of course, to mention this. Which brings me to my seventh point. The official story can be believed because it has been verified by the 9/11 Commission, which was a fully independent and impartial commission. Philip Zelikow, and it's not Kane and Hamilton who run the commission. They're the guys you see on TV. The commission the work was done by a staff of about 75, and Philip Zelikow, as the executive director, told them what to do, what topics to research, which ones not. He could determine what things went in the final report, which things not. He was in charge, and yet he was a virtual member of the Bush administration. He and Condoleezza Rice had been together in the former Bush administration. Then when the Republicans were out of office, they wrote a book together. When she came on to be National Security Advisor for the second President Bush, she brought Zelikow on to help with the transition. Then he's appointed to the Presidential's Emergency Military Information Board. And most important, which most people don't know yet, when Rice had to produce the National Security Strategy of the United States of America, 2002, Richard Haass in the State Department wrote a document, and she found it far too weak. She wanted something much bolder, so she brought on Philip Zelikow. And it's this document that he was the primary author of that enunciated the Bush Doctrine, the doctrine that we will no longer wait for our enemies to get strong enough to attack them. We will go on the offense. Philip Zelikow then, of course, was appointed to head the 9/11 Commission, which should have been investigating whether the White House might have been involved in 9/11. There's a little more about Philip Zelikow. In 1998, he co-authored an essay suggesting that an act of catastrophic terrorism involving the World Trade Center would be a watershed event in American history. It could involve a loss of life and property unprecedented in peacetime and undermine America's fundamental sense of security. Like Pearl Harbor, this event would divide our past and future into a before and after. The United States might respond with draconian measures, scaling back civil liberties, allowing wider surveillance of citizens, detention of suspects, and use of deadly force. And of course, that's exactly what happened after the new Pearl Harbor. Is this the guy you would want in charge of a commission investigating who was really responsible for 9/11? Okay, I have concluded that the official story, and I think I've provided sufficient evidence that it's false. It's a false flag operation. So now I come to my main theme. This will be brief, and I will read it to you to get it exactly right, what I want to say. Assuming that this is the truth about 9/11, should this truth be revealed or concealed? The 9/11 Truth Movement has, of course, operated with the assumption that, of course, it should be revealed, and that everyone else except the perpetrators would agree. And this is surely true of most people. But to elite members of our societies, it may not be so obvious. By the elite, I mean the people who largely determine what happens and doesn't happen. The political, military, financial, and corporate leaders of our societies, including the owners of the mass media. They may fear that exposing the truth about 9/11 would lead to a crisis of confidence that would be worse, that would lead to consequences worse than letting the perpetrators of 9/11 get away with it. The global economy is already in a precarious state, they may likely argue, and a crisis of confidence in the institutions of the world's most powerful nation could lead to a global meltdown. There is no doubt, I would agree, that a global economic collapse would be a real possibility and that it would have severe consequences that could well last for many years. So yes, having the truth about 9/11 revealed so that it becomes part of our public discourse might indeed have dire consequences. There is only one thing that would be worse: continuing to have the truth about 9/11 concealed. Why so? We are facing the likelihood of a global collapse that will be far worse than an economic collapse. I refer, of course, to an ecological collapse, which is very likely to occur within the present century unless our policies are changed rapidly and radically. This ecological collapse could be brought on quickly through a nuclear winter caused by even a small exchange of nuclear weapons, or more slowly through runaway global warming. The United States government has long been the major impediment to a solution to both of these problems. But since 9/11, the United States government has become even more dangerous, ridiculing global warming while practicing an extreme version of double standards in relation to nuclear technology, denying to enemies the right to develop nuclear energy while planning to strengthen its own arsenal of nuclear weapons and even to position them in space. Apart from a revelation of the truth about 9/11, there is little chance that the present trajectory of U.S. policy, with its threat to the survival of civilization itself, will change. Even a change of administrations will probably result only in minor changes, apart from a revelation of the truth about 9/11. Because the present mythology about 9/11 will be used to justify continuing the focus on human relations rather than the chief issue of our day, the relation of human civilization to the natural world in which we are embedded. Although I and other members of the 9/11 Truth Movement in the United States continue to hope that our Congress and/or our mass media will finally expose the truth about 9/11, there is realistically little chance of this happening. So I'm here to call you and fellow Europeans to find a way to discover and then expose the truth about 9/11, perhaps through the creation of a high-level citizens panel of highly respected members. Bring members of the 9/11 Truth Movement to testify. I'm not talking about a new group that would start from scratch and do research. No, make it more like a jury and hear the evidence on both sides. And then if you can get anyone from the 9/11 Commission and NIST and the U.S. government to testify, then weigh the evidence and issue a ruling to the world. So that is my call to you. That is my challenge.
I'd like to call upon the Secretary of the 9/11 Truth Movement for Britain and Ireland to offer a vote of thanks to Dr. David Ray Griffin. Ladies and gentlemen, Annie Machon.
It always makes me feel slightly odd being called the Secretary. Perhaps you should start calling me Miss Moneypenny. I want to start off just by saying a few words of thanks. First of all, to all the activists from around the country who have given their time, their dedication and their resources to making this evening a success. Without the commitment of people, we could never have pulled off something as big and as amazing as tonight. It's just a testament to how far we've come in a year, so thank you very much. And of course, also, I'd like to say a big thank you to our speakers tonight. Obviously, Ian Crane has been a very capable and very inspirational chair for the last few months, and long may that continue. Thanks also to David Shaler. What can I say? Amazingly powerful speech, and thank you for his grit and tenacity in what he's doing. And finally, what can I say? Thank you so much, Professor Griffin, for coming over here. Like many people, perhaps in this hall, the first thing that really opened my eyes to the whole issue of 9/11 was the book, The New Pearl Harbor. And it's just such a privilege to hear the words spoken from the horse's mouth tonight. It was powerful, it was stirring, and again, it was inspirational. So thank you very much. And how can I forget? Because from painful personal experience, there's always the woman behind the man who puts his head above the parapet. So we'd just like to say a big thank you to Anne, Professor Griffin's wife, and just give her a little token of our regard for all the support she's given to him over the years. So thank you all very much for coming, and I'll pass you back over to Ian Crane. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. I think we can't emphasize enough the support that everybody who is active in the truth movement needs from their partner. This is a very, very difficult issue for many relationships. What we've seen in the press this week is some very interesting articles, not least one in Time magazine titled, "Why the Conspiracy Theories Won't Go Away." In the course of that article, it stated that 36% of Americans think that the American administration, the Bush administration, was either complicit or partially complicit in the events of 9/11. 36% is mainstream. Governments get elected on 36%. This issue is not going to go away. In fact, we were discussing earlier, and for those of us who have been in the movement now, we've seen it grow and grow exponentially. And you know, we cannot think of one single person who has recognized that the official version of events does not stand up to scrutiny. If they believe that, they never go back. We do not know of any individual that has gone back to believe the official account. And this is going to continue. This event is not going away. The Time article went on to suggest that with the end of the Bush-Cheney administration, the 9/11 conspiracy theorists would disappear. Wrong. We're here for the duration to get the truth out. And tonight, thanks to David Shaler and Ray Griffin, I think this has really been a tremendous evening. Thank you very much. We'll see you in about 30 minutes. Okay. Dr. David Ray Griffin is going to take the stand. I shall read the question. This question is from Asif Salahuddin. And the question is, the fact that Al-Qaeda has been found guilty for 9/11 has in fact been translated into the whole Muslim community, both in the UK and overseas, of being guilty. What steps are being taken to get the Muslim community on board the 9/11 truth movement? They will be eager to expose the truth. May I suggest to start with interviews, etc., etc., etc. Please comment.
In my newer book, Christian Faith and the Truth Behind 9/11, I discuss, develop a notion of the divine and demonic, and then suggest that the demonic, which I give a definition of, which I call a realistic but non-mythological definition, is now embodied primarily in the United States. And I give several reasons why the United States is an evil empire, is demonic, and why 9/11 in particular is part of that demonic. And one of the major reasons is that through 9/11, because of 9/11, Muslims around the world are now guilty until proven innocent. And that is a terrible way to live on the face of the planet. Now, the Muslims are... Muslims, of course, are not very happy with that. And the Muslim world... they don't need meetings like this. They've been aware that 9/11 was a false flag operation for a long time. At least this is very widespread, 9/11 movement. This will be discussed in a forthcoming book by Kevin Barrett, John Cobb, and Sandra Lubarsky, a Muslim, a Christian, and a Jew, called 9/11 and American Empire, Christians, Jews, and Muslims Speak Out. It should be out by the end of the month. Kevin Barrett is an American who grew up not a Muslim, but converted some years back, married a Muslim woman from Morocco. And he started an organization called, he admits it's an ugly abbreviation, Mujka.com, stands for Muslims, Jews, and Christians United for 9/11 Truth. He was the one, in fact, who invited me to Wisconsin, to Madison, where I gave that speech that did get played on C-SPAN, and then inspired this book, that book, and the other book that I mentioned earlier, 9/11 American Empire Intellectuals Speak Out. So I understand there is a UK version of Mujka.com. Can anybody speak to that. I believe if you just, do I have the, is that right, muchka.com or just muchka? Pardon? That is right. So you can go on Google and, or whatever the equivalent is and find that. mujca.com.
The next question is from Sue Davey. It says, the number one question we are faced with when trying to tell people the facts of 9/11 is that this is such a huge question to have done as a false flag op. Why is it that virtually none of the people involved have come forward to tell about it?
This is one of the big 2 or 3 questions that I get, so it is a widespread question, which at first glance sounds reasonable that, gee, somebody should have come forward. But when you think it through, you realize, first of all, in operations like this, you have an inner core of a fairly small group. Then you have an outer group who are somewhat involved, but they don't know the whole picture. They just know they were told to do this and then keep their mouths shut, and that it was for the good of the country. And then you have a larger group yet who, after the fact, learned that they were part of something that they're not proud of, but were not complicit. So if we begin with the first group, these are people who are tried and tested and have been proven capable of keeping their mouths shut. Furthermore, why would they talk and make themselves liable to the death penalty for treason and mass murder? With the next group, again, they're all government employees for the most part, and can be threatened with prison or worse. And when you think about that, what that means, you lose your source of livelihood, you can no longer support your family, and so on. If that kind of threat doesn't work, you can say something like, well, Steve, if you go forward like you're thinking about doing, I don't know who's going to protect your wife and kids. Would you go forward? Particularly when there's nobody in the media or the 9/11 Commission begging you to come forward and tell the truth. In fact, if you do speak up, you'll be ridiculed as a conspiracy theorist. So when you think it through, it's not surprising that nobody involved has talked.
Okay, a 2-part question from Amir Akhtar. This is both related to Building 7. First part of the question is, what was the official reason given for the collapse of World Trade Center 7 as per the Commission report? And the second part of the question is, and what was Larry Silverstein's official reason for pulling it?
The background to the 9/11 Commission's treatment of this issue was the fact that the first report was put out by FEMA. Now, they didn't do the work themselves. It was another group, American Society of Civil Engineers. But they were all, it was a volunteer group, and that's how seriously this was taken. They came up with their explanation for the towers, but then when they got to Building 7, they devised a scenario in which steel beams flew from one of the towers, the closer tower, and went into the building, and then there was some diesel fuel in there, and set that on fire, and turned the building into a raging inferno, and that brought it down. One little problem, of course, is there were pictures taken of Building 7 late in the afternoon, and there are fires on about 3 floors of a 47-story building, so not quite a roaring inferno. The report then said at the end, well, the best scenario we've been able to come up with has a very low probability of occurrence. So that's what the 9/11 Commission had to work with. In other words, we don't have a clue why Building 7 collapsed. That is, assuming we can't mention explosives, we don't have a clue as to how to explain the collapse of Building 7. So the 9/11 Commission treated this by not even mentioning this in its 571-page report. Now, this is phenomenal. The official story about the Twin Towers is they came down because these planes hit them and got them so destabilized, or the new report is from NIST, it's because it knocked the fireproofing off the steel. But you can't make that claim with Building 7 because no airplane hit it. So the 9/11 Commission evidently thought the better part of wisdom here was simply, let's just not mention Building 7 and hope the public doesn't notice. The NIST now has done about the same thing because they can't claim that the fireproofing was knocked off. It's a ridiculous claim anyway. Fireproofing only lasts for about 2 hours in a big fire. And as we've seen, other buildings have burned for 18 hours, and so they were exposed to the flames for 16 hours. And the South Tower was only exposed to flame for 56 minutes. So it's a ridiculous claim, but it's the only claim they've got. So, and they can't apply it to Building 7. And so they've solved the problem by delaying their report. So their latest website indicates that it'll come out after the next election. He clearly made this statement. It's on a PBS special. You can listen to it. You can go on Google, listen to it. Well, he claims now, and the State Department claims now, that, of course, what he meant was there's been such a loss of life. What he said was, so I talked to the fire captain, commander, and we decided we would just pull it. And so we waited, and we watched Building 7 collapsed. They try to reinterpret that to mean that what he meant was it was the contingent of fire people in there, the firemen and the firewomen. So that he says, when I said pull it, I didn't mean pull the building. I meant pull the contingent of fire. Problem is, you listen to it, and he says, we decided to pull it, and then we watched it collapse. And furthermore, the fire people were pulled out of there about noon. It didn't collapse until 5:20 in the afternoon. So it really strains credulity.
Yeah, question regarding Dr. Stephen Jones, who, of course, is the author of the report, Why Indeed Did the World Trade Center Towers Collapse? Says Dr. Steve Jones has been suspended by Brigham Young University in Utah. What is the best way of supporting him?
Write to the administration of BYU, Brigham Young University. Not hard to find the address. I think it might impress them if they know that people from the UK know about this and care about it and are distressed about it and wonder what kind of institution of higher education this is when a professor of physics who makes his judgment on the basis purely of scientific evidence concludes that this could only have been an inside job. And the accusation brought against Stephen Jones is that he has accused the American government, in other words, the Bush administration, of a crime. So that is, from my point of view, as a professor emeritus in a country that prides itself on academic freedom, this is simply outrageous that you could be fired from your position. Now, he's not fired, he's put on paid leave, but that could lead to termination. They do not have a tenure policy. They have a policy of expectation to continue. So it's much easier to dismiss for cause. This is distressing to P. Dale Scott and me, because we edited the book and we worked out with Stephen an agreement that it was very difficult to put all the photographs in the book that he wanted, but his whole article depends upon you looking at the pictures. So it was coordinated with his website So he would say, now look at page, such and such photo, and you would be reading his article and looking on your computer at the same time. And the determination isn't clear. They clearly forced him to take it off their website. Now the question is, are they going to even allow him to have a link to say, if you're looking for my paper, go here? They may even refuse that. We don't know at this stage. But they are being very subservient to the powers that be, which is distressing for a religious institution that is supposed to put its loyalty to God above loyalty to any earthly administration. That reminds me, if I can add a footnote, just a few weeks ago I was on Tucker Carlson's show. If you know this show, it's a right-wing talk show on MSNBC, and they came in, did 5 minutes, and we were talking about my new book, Christian Faith and the Truth Behind 9/11, and he began by accusing me of, for writing this book, of sin and blasphemy. And it's apparent that he confused Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld with the Holy Trinity.
A perfect lead-in to the next question from Graham Mortimer Evelyn. He says, should the Truth Movement emphasize to the Christian church and those of the Christian faith the importance of engaging with the facts and manipulations of the events of 9/11?
Of course, it should be the other way. It should be the Christian movement emphasizing to the rest of the country the importance of dealing with the truth about 9/11. Because if you're involved with any religion that thinks in terms of the universe as a whole, the world as a whole, and our ultimate loyalty is to that, not to any earthly kingdom, then if a lie has been told that is used to separate us one from the other, so those of us who talk about God believe that God loves, has created, and loves and is compassionate towards all creatures, all human beings, a movement that is used to divide us, and a movement that is used to rape and pillage. This should be of utmost religious concern. What could be of more religious concern? And then as I argue at the end of this lecture and in the book, we're really facing an unprecedented crisis. The big story of the 20th century was the century in which we became aware that for the first time in billions of years, one species had gotten to the point where it could eliminate the whole ecosphere and therefore eliminate almost all the other species. This is big stuff. This is unprecedented. This is irreversible. And if that is not front and center in any form of theistic religion or any form of religion whatsoever that talks about the good of the whole, then there's a great distortion of priorities going on. Now, as far as what the Truth Movement can do, I really think it is simply a matter of convincing these people of the truth. Once they see this, it'll be obvious to most Christians, most Jews, it's already obvious to most Muslims, that this is a matter of utmost priority. So I would say just keep on keeping on, but I would say let's give special attention to focusing on religious leaders who can then bring along their people and educate them and let them know this is a matter of utmost importance. So thank you for that question. Excellent.
Staying in the theological vein, a question from Robbie Hoke says, do you use the word evil, and would you use that word to describe the forces behind the events of 9/11?
Indeed. I would, and I did. One section in my chapter in there is next to the last chapter is called Evil Empire. As I say, I developed a notion of the demonic because what has happened since the Enlightenment is that religious liberals have rejected the notion of a literal Satan, a literal devil, but then they went ahead and rejected the notion of demonic power altogether. And that has led to a rather superficial view of the human situation and made us think that, nothing really serious is going to happen, and certainly led us not to think in terms of being in thrall, of being entranced, of being seduced, of being subjugated to demonic power. You know, if you read the New Testament, that is what sin is primarily in the New Testament. You know, it's not doing this or that bad thing. You do bad things because you are in subjugation to the demonic. Now, that time they thought, seems fairly clear in terms of a literal demonic power. I know many Christians do today. I don't. I'm among the liberals who have rejected that literal view. But I do argue that it does seem apparent as we look back through the 19th and the 20th century, and now especially the beginnings of the 21st century, that we are in subjugation to some sort of power that we can only call demonic because it is leading us to self-destruction, like lemmings to the sea, just like we're hypnotized. And here we've had the ecological crisis brought to our attention. For the last almost 40 years now, we have done virtually nothing to solve it. We've done little local things, cleaned up some water and so on. But in terms of the global problems, global warming, huge problems, done virtually nothing. We're not stupid. It seems like we're in subjugation. We're hypnotized. We're in a trance. We can't focus on the big issue. And now 9/11, when we were ready, saying the Cold War is over, now we can focus on the ecological crisis. Then bam, 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 we're right back into the human-human war again. So I do suggest that the Bush administration is particularly subjected to this. So you see, I use the term demonic rather than the term sin because sin has come to be understood in such an individualistic way. You know, he's a sinful person. He's just deliberately doing evil. And even sometimes when we say that's an evil person, people say, well, do you think Bush is evil? Do you think Cheney's evil? Well, sure, but that's not the issue. It's not them as individuals. It's that there's a whole cultural mindset among the elite in America and among the military that believes in domination and that believes that it is fine to dominate others and talks in terms of the haves and the have-nots, and we're going to keep it that way. In fact, I just happen to have a good quote on this. This was made in 1997, but it shows the military mindset that is reflected in 9/11 and now in the Bush administration. Because another way to understand the Bush administration is they've just bought the mindset of the leaders of the Pentagon, which has been there for a long time. This is a Major Ralph Peters. Have any of you, it's been going around the web, but let me read you just this purple passage. We are, it's called Constant Conflict. We are entering a new American century in which we will become still wealthier, culturally more lethal, and increasingly powerful. We will excite hatreds without precedent. We will see countries and continents divide between rich and poor. The have-nots will hate and strive to attack the haves, and we in the United States will continue to be perceived as the ultimate haves. There will be no peace. At any given moment, for the rest of our lifetimes, there will be multiple conflicts in mutating forms around the globe. The de facto role of the U.S. Armed Forces will be to keep the world safe for our economy and open to our cultural assault. To those ends, we will do a fair amount of killing. That's not said in criticism. This is said in the attitude, this, of course, is what we have to do. We have to keep our number one position and even increase our cultural assault.
Malthusian philosophy is alive and well. With the announcement in Time magazine that 36% of Americans doubt the veracity of the official account of 9/11, do you have concerns that the neocons will not tolerate the growth of the 9/11 movement and take action to close it down?
Well, it's always possible. These movements always have at least two stages, and we're in the second stage now. The first stage is where they just ignore you and figure you will self-destruct. And there has been some self-destructive activity going on within the 9/11 movement, but the more constructive movement of speaking to the people and getting the word out has prevailed. And that shows in these polls. That poll 36. There was another poll that asked, do you believe there has been a cover-up of the truth? 42% said yes. This was a Zogby poll. Only 48% said they were confident there had not been a cover-up. 10% were uncertain. So that means not even 50% of the American people, as poorly educated as we are and as poorly informed as we have been by the mass media, not even 50% believe the official story is true. So the movement has been very successful. So now we're in the second stage where they are attacking full scale. A story appears almost every 2 or 3 days, or a new video, or a new something. So things are really heating up. If that fails, and thus far, from what I see, it looks like it will fail because they're just informing people, like this story tells all these things that loose change says, and then doesn't rebut any of them. It just says, oh, well, people who are conspiracy theorists who have a certain mindset, they're going to believe this nonsense, but don't refute any of the evidence that's provided in loose change. Well, a lot of people are smart enough to see through that. So I suspect this second stage is going to backfire, so the movement will continue to grow. So it's quite possible that they will decide at some stage they have to take some more drastic action and move to the third stage.
Dr. Ray Griffin, that's unfortunately all we have time for. But thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know there was a lot of people who were disappointed that you weren't able to sign their books, so would you be prepared to sign a few more?
My hand will last for a few more books.
Okay, so Dr. Ray Griffin will join us there. Thank you very much. Please join me. Dr. David Ray Griffin.